Have you ever sat across from a con artist, watching him toast the room with money he stole from the very people applauding him? That night at Chicago's most exclusive restaurant, my brother thought he had humiliated me in front of our 25 relatives. He had no idea his soon-to-be declined credit card was merely the appetizer, and the waiter he was currently screaming at held a secret ready to shatter his entire counterfeit life. Hello to all the wonderful listeners of Maya Revenge Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube has recently disabled our monetization features, leaving us without a budget to keep our operations running. If you find today's story engaging, please consider supporting us with just $1 so our team can cover their living expenses and continue creating more stories for you. You can easily support us by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the donation link in the description or the pinned comment section of this video. My name is Simone French. I am 32 years old, and my profession involves wading through the financial wreckage created by the wealthy, the arrogant, and the profoundly stupid. I work as a crisis management and distressed asset acquisition specialist at Aegis Vanguard Holdings. You will never see our name on a glowing corporate marquee or listed on a public stock exchange. We operate as a highly secretive internal investment fund, moving quietly in the shadows of the corporate elite. When a millionaire heir gambles away a generational portfolio, or a reckless chief executive officer drives a company into the ground, I am the one who sweeps in. I purchase their toxic debt for pennies on the dollar, restructure their remaining assets, and quietly bury their mistakes. My daily life is governed by cold mathematics, ironclad legal contracts, and the brutal, unforgiving reality of American capitalism. It is a world where there is absolutely no room for sentimentality. This brings me to my brother, Julian. Julian is 29 years old and serves as the perfect antithesis to everything I stand for. He is a self-proclaimed tech entrepreneur, hailing from the delusion-filled echo chambers of Silicon Valley. If you were to encounter him, you would instantly recognize the archetype. He practically lives in a black turtleneck, desperately attempting to channel the ghost of Steve Jobs. He aggressively flashes the keys to his brand new Tesla, and he possesses an uncanny ability to speak for hours without actually saying anything of substance. His current grand illusion is a luxury lifestyle application he calls Aura. According to Julian's endless monologues, Aura will revolutionize high-end networking. According to my trained analytical eye, it is nothing more than a digital mirage designed solely to siphon money from gullible investors. Yet, to our parents and our sprawling network of aunts and uncles, Julian is a certified visionary. At every family gathering, they sit completely spellbound as he throws around meaningless corporate buzzwords. They look at his leased car and his perfectly curated social media presence and see a financial prodigy. When they look at me, however, they see a tragic disappointment. They consider my quiet, methodical career in distressed assets to be painfully boring and severely lacking in ambition. My parents frequently pull me aside to suggest that a woman so obsessed with balance sheets will inevitably die alone. The bitter irony, which I have kept hidden for years, is that I am the sole reason our parents are not living on the streets. 3 separate times over the last decade, Julian's manic business ventures crashed and burned, leaving behind catastrophic debt. Because he secretly leveraged our parents' home to fund his fantasies, the creditors came for them. 3 times. I quietly liquidated my own personal investments to pay off the massive deficits, halting the foreclosure processes just hours before they became public record. I did it entirely to protect my parents from heartbreak. Julian, however, operates with the chilling mindset of a white-collar sociopath. He twisted reality, telling our entire extended family that I had begged him for a piece of the action. He claimed he had graciously allowed me to make early angel investments in his startups. He genuinely convinced them that my life savings were just a risky gamble. He was doing me a favor by accepting. Then, Chloe entered the picture. Chloe was Julian's newly minted fiancée. She was a gentle, deeply empathetic emergency room nurse who spent her grueling shifts saving lives, only to come home and fall prey to Julian's fabricated charm. She was everything he was not: honest, grounded, and pure. But more importantly to Julian, she was flush with cash. Chloe had recently inherited a trust fund totaling $250,000 from her late grandmother. I knew instantly that Julian did not see a life partner when he looked at Chloe. He saw an unmonitored bank account. I maintained my distance, fully expecting this new scheme to eventually implode on its own. That was until a specific, chilling detail forced my hand. Exactly 1 month before their extravagant engagement party was set to occur, I was reviewing a bankruptcy file while passively scrolling through my phone. I stopped breathing for a second when I saw a fresh post on Julian's Instagram page. It featured a photo of him smirking, holding a glass of expensive champagne. The caption declared, "Massive milestone. Aura has just been financially backed by the titans at Aegis Vanguard Holdings. We are taking over." I stared at the bright screen, feeling the air in my office turn to ice. Aegis Vanguard Holdings was my firm. It was a ruthless, closed-door entity that absolutely never invested in startup applications, never publicized its maneuvers, and certainly never handed cash to 29-year-old frauds. Julian had crossed a very dangerous line. He had, without realizing it, dragged his house of cards directly onto my battlefield. The phone call that shattered the quiet of my office came late on a Thursday evening. When I answered, Chloe's voice was barely a whisper, trembling with a frantic, uncharacteristic edge. She apologized profusely for bypassing Julian, but the panic in her tone was unmistakable. She needed to ask me about the standard disbursement procedures for Aegis Vanguard Holdings. According to her, Julian had urgently requested that she transfer $150,000 into a corporate escrow account managed by my firm. He had claimed this was a mandatory matching capital requirement to unlock our supposed institutional backing for his application. I kept my breathing steady, masking the sudden spike of adrenaline in my veins. I calmly asked her to forward the paperwork Julian had given her. Less than 2 minutes later, a digital document materialized in my encrypted inbox. I opened the file, and within 5 seconds, the illusion collapsed. To an untrained eye, the contract looked formidable, complete with heavy legal jargon and official corporate branding. To a crisis management specialist who spent her days dismantling fraudulent empires, it was a shockingly clumsy forgery. Julian had digitally lifted my signature from an outdated personal loan file I had co-signed for him nearly a decade ago. He had manipulated the image, but the pixel degradation around the ink strokes was blatantly obvious. Furthermore, the final indemnification clause was typed in a completely different font than the rest of the document. The crowning piece of his amateur hour, however, was the corporate seal stamped at the bottom. It bore the insignia of a subsidiary branch we had permanently dissolved 4 years ago. I told Chloe that I would personally oversee the routing of the funds and instructed her not to say a single word to Julian about our conversation. The moment I disconnected the call, I did not confront my brother. Confrontation is for amateurs who operate on emotion. Instead, I quietly retained the services of an elite, independent forensic accounting firm based out of New York. I gave them carte blanche to strip Julian's financial existence down to the bare studs and track every single penny that moved through his orbit. 72 hours later, the lead investigator sent me a secure, heavily encrypted dossier. Reading through the forensic trail, a cold, clinical fury settled over me. Chloe's $150,000 had never touched any institutional investment fund. The money had been violently fractured, laundered through a series of shell companies, and bled dry. A massive portion of her inheritance had been wired directly to offshore accounts to settle crippling debts with an illegal sports betting syndicate. Another large chunk had been used to cover 6 months of severely delinquent rent on his flashy downtown penthouse. The final fraction had been handed over as a non-refundable security deposit for their upcoming, outrageously lavish engagement party at the Obsidian Room, widely known as the most exclusive, impenetrable private club in Chicago. Julian was not building a technology company. He was funding a manic, unsustainable lifestyle using his future wife as a human banking terminal. But as I turned to the final page of the investigator's report, My blood ran completely cold. The betrayal ran far deeper than a stolen inheritance. The forensic team had uncovered a secondary, infinitely more sinister financial hemorrhage. Julian had not just robbed his fiancée, he had cannibalized our family. Buried in county property records was a newly minted home equity line of credit. Julian had fabricated a durable power of attorney, forging our father's signature and getting it illicitly notarized. Using this fraudulent document, he had secretly mortgaged our parents' fully paid-off suburban house. He had extracted exactly $100,000 in hard equity and immediately converted the cash into untraceable cryptocurrency, dumping it into a digital wallet controlled by a phantom overseas developer who did not actually exist. He had essentially placed a loaded financial gun to our parents' heads, risking their only sanctuary and their entire retirement, all to maintain his pathetic charade. The sheer audacity of his crimes required a catastrophic response. I could have called the authorities right then, but simply arresting him would leave the financial damage unresolved and allow him to spin a victim narrative to our family. He needed to be exposed in an arena where his lies could not protect him, where the evidence was undeniable. I picked up my secure line and called my personal corporate attorney. I laid out the meticulously documented evidence of wire fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny. Working through the night, we drafted a devastating legal instrument, an emergency ex parte freezing injunction. It was a financial guillotine, designed to sever him from every single asset, credit line, and bank account bearing his name. I did not execute the order immediately. Instead, I instructed my legal team to file the injunction under a strict, automated delay. I built a digital time bomb. The asset freeze was programmed to go live and aggressively lock every financial avenue he possessed at exactly 8 o'clock in the evening on the upcoming Saturday. That Saturday was the night of his grand engagement party at the Obsidian Room. I was going to let him dress up, gather our entire family, and stand at the absolute pinnacle of his fraudulent empire before I burned it to the ground. The heavy brushed brass doors of the Obsidian Room parted silently, and our 25 extended family members shuffled into the dimly lit foyer, their eyes wide with a potent mixture of reverence and deep-seated insecurity. This was not merely a restaurant. It was a fortress of extreme wealth, a place where the air itself felt heavy with the scent of old money, rare mahogany, and imported truffles. My aunts, uncles, and cousins moved tentatively, clutching their cheap evening bags and adjusting their rented suits, completely intimidated by the suffocating opulence of the private club. Standing at the threshold of the grand private dining suite, bathed in the warm glow of a cascading crystal chandelier, was Julian. He had abandoned his usual Silicon Valley attire for a bespoke velvet dinner jacket, positioning himself perfectly to receive his guests like a conquering monarch holding court. He greeted each relative with a practiced, politician-style handshake, making sure his voice carried across the cavernous room. "Welcome, everyone, welcome," Julian announced, gesturing expansively toward the massive, candlelit banquet table. It took some serious maneuvering and a few high-level connections to secure this specific VIP room on a Saturday night. The waiting list is generally 6 months long, but when you know the right people in the upper echelons of this city, doors tend to open. A chorus of impressed murmurs rippled through the family. My mother dabbed her eyes with a tissue, whispering to Aunt Martha about how incredibly proud she was of her visionary son. I walked past him, offering nothing but a brief, chilling smile, and took my seat near the center of the table. The tragic, comedic irony of his grandstanding was almost too delicious to bear. Julian was bragging about his elite connections to secure a table in a building that I practically owned. The truth, buried beneath layers of corporate non-disclosure agreements, was that the Obsidian Room had suffered a catastrophic liquidity crisis and quietly filed for bankruptcy exactly 2 years ago. Aegis Vanguard Holdings had swooped in and purchased the distressed asset for a fraction of its true value. I personally restructured its operations, and I currently sit as the anonymous entity holding 80% of the controlling equity. The immaculately dressed general manager standing discreetly in the corner of the room knew exactly who I was. I had sent him a highly encrypted memorandum that morning, issuing strict directives that I was to be treated as an ordinary, unrecognized guest tonight. I wanted Julian to have his stage. As the evening progressed, the multi-course dinner devolved into a masterclass in psychological projection and subtle humiliation. Course after course of Wagyu beef and butter-poached lobster arrived, and Julian used every opportunity to elevate himself by systematically tearing me down. He held his crystal wine glass by the stem, leaning back in his plush leather chair, and fixed his gaze on me from across the table. "You see, Uncle Arthur?" Julian projected his voice, ensuring the entire room was listening. "The problem with my sister's line of work is that it completely lacks soul. Simone spends her days burying her head in dry spreadsheets, chasing pennies in the dark. It is purely transactional. She has absolutely zero understanding of human connection value. I build platforms that bring humanity together. Simone just liquidates things." He paused, offering a condescending sigh. "Honestly, women who dedicate their entire existence to climbing a cold financial ladder usually end up dying alone in a very expensive, very empty house. You have to have a heart to build a legacy, right?" The table erupted in polite, sycophantic laughter. My aunts nodded vigorously in agreement, swirling the vintage wine they could never afford on their own salaries, entirely captivated by his performance. My father cleared his throat, adjusting his collar, and decided to join the firing squad. "Your brother really has a point, Simone," my father said, using a tone dripping with misplaced paternal wisdom. "You always measure every single thing in life by profit and loss. You really should take a page from Julian's book. Learn to be a bit more open. Stop being so incredibly calculating and transactional with your own flesh and blood. Family is not a ledger." I sat in absolute silence. I did not defend myself. I did not mention that the very house my father was sleeping in had been secretly mortgaged by his golden child. Nor did I mention that the calculating daughter he was currently insulting had saved him from bankruptcy 3 separate times. I simply picked up my glass, took a slow, deliberate sip of the dark red wine, and let my eyes do the working. I observed Julian's left hand as he gestured wildly to emphasize his brilliance. Gleaming under the overhead lights was a massive, solid gold Rolex Daytona. It was a beautiful timepiece, undoubtedly purchased using the stolen fragments of his fiancée's inheritance. I then shifted my gaze to Chloe, who was seated directly to his right. The poor woman looked physically ill, while Julian basked in the adoration of our deluded family. Chloe was shrinking into her chair. Her complexion was pale. Her shoulders were hunched, and she was aggressively gnawing at her cuticles, a nervous habit that had left her fingers raw and bleeding. She knew the money was gone. She knew I was watching. The psychological weight of the room was entirely focused on the wrong target, and the tension was so thick it felt like breathing underwater. I slowly turned my wrist and glanced at the face of my watch. The hands aligned perfectly. It was 7:55 in the evening. A string quartet was playing a beautiful, sweeping classical melody in the background, filling the dining room with a sense of romantic grandeur. But I could not hear the cellos or the violins. Inside my head, the only sound was the rhythmic, deafening tick of the digital time bomb I had planted in Julian's financial infrastructure. The blast radius was set. The fuse was burning down to its final millimeters. 5 minutes remained until total annihilation. The dessert plates, painted with remnants of gold leaf and dark chocolate ganache, were quietly cleared away by the invisible waitstaff. A heavy, expectant hush fell over the long banquet table as Julian aggressively tapped a silver dessert spoon against his crystal champagne flute. The sharp, piercing sound cut through the low hum of conversation, demanding absolute attention from the room. He rose slowly from his plush leather chair, swaying just a fraction of an inch, heavily intoxicated by a potent cocktail of expensive vintage alcohol and his own limitless narcissism. He held his glass high, letting the warm chandelier light catch the rising bubbles. His eyes scanned the 25 faces staring up at him with breathless adoration, but his gaze purposefully bypassed his trembling fiancée and locked violently onto me. "To family," Julian began, his voice booming with artificial warmth and practiced charisma, "and to the extraordinary journey that brought us all to this incredible milestone. But as we sit here tonight, surrounded by success and vision, I cannot help but notice the stark contrasts among us." He took a slow theatrical step away from his chair, leaning his knuckles on the polished wood of the table, bringing his face closer to mine. The mask of the gracious host slipped away, revealing the terrified, vicious little boy hiding underneath. "Simone always prioritizes contracts over people," Julian declared, his voice echoing loudly off the mahogany walls. "Honestly, at this level, she is no longer in the same world as our family." A suffocating, deathly silence slammed down on the room. No one moved. Then, a few cowardly giggles erupted from the far end of the table. I scanned the faces of my 25 relatives. These were the exact same aunts, uncles, and cousins who had quietly begged me for personal loans to cover their emergency medical bills, their underwater mortgages, and their overdue credit card statements. Yet, right now, bathed in the false glow of Julian's fabricated wealth, not a single one of them had the spine to stand up and defend me. I looked toward the head of the table. My mother and father simply turned their faces away, staring intensely at their empty plates, implicitly endorsing his public execution of my character. I did not flinch, I did not raise my voice, and I certainly did not give him the satisfaction of looking angry. Instead, a slow, chilling smile spread across my face. I looked right through him. I knew exactly what this was. This was not a spontaneous insult. It was a desperately calculated, preemptive strike. Julian was using this public humiliation as a psychological barricade. He was trying to tear down my credibility in front of the entire family so that if I dared to raise any questions about the missing trust fund money or the fraudulent financial maneuvers I might have sniffed out, I would look like a bitter, jealous sister trying to ruin his big night. He was barking loudly because he was fundamentally terrified. Then I felt it, a sharp solitary vibration against my thigh. I did not need to check my wristwatch to know the exact time. It was precisely 8 o'clock at night. I slowly reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and kept it hidden beneath the edge of the tablecloth. The screen illuminated the darkness with a single, encrypted text message from my lead corporate attorney. "The freeze order is in effect. The net is cast." It was done. At this exact second, automated financial protocols were slamming shut across the country. Every bank account, every line of credit, every digital wallet, and every fraudulent corporate card attached to Julian's name had been instantly paralyzed by a federal judge's mandate. He was completely cut off from the world. He was currently standing in a private club that he could not afford, breathing air he had no right to consume, completely oblivious to the invisible guillotine that had just severed his financial head. Julian decided to push his delusional victory lap even further. Believing he had thoroughly crushed me into submission, he turned around and aggressively snapped his fingers in the air, a profoundly disrespectful gesture aimed at the approaching head waiter. "You!" Julian barked, pulling a sleek metal card from his jacket and waving it in the air. "We are celebrating tonight. Bring us 3 more bottles of your absolute best Louis Roederer Cristal champagne. Put it directly on the Aura Company account. I want to treat my whole family right." The head waiter offered a tight, professional nod. Taking the heavy metal card from Julian's outstretched hand, he walked over to a discreet service station just a few feet away, retrieving a black point of sale terminal. Julian leaned back, crossing his arms with a smug, triumphant grin, soaking in the renewed murmurs of awe from our greedy relatives. The waiter inserted the card into the machine. The heavy romantic atmosphere of the private dining room suddenly felt completely wrong. The string quartet was still playing, but the air pressure in the room seemed to violently drop. We all heard it. It was a sharp, electronic beep, followed immediately by a harsh, buzzing rejection tone from the machine. The small digital screen flashed a bright, angry red error message. The waiter pulled the card out, wiped the chip on his apron, and calmly inserted it a second time. Another harsh, negative buzz echoed through the quiet room. The flawless illusion had just hit a brick wall. The machine buzzed again. Julian frowned, snatched the metal card back, and pulled out a second one, a heavy platinum credit card. The waiter inserted it. A harsh beep followed. Declined. Julian's face flushed a deep, angry crimson. He frantically dug into his wallet, producing a third card, his hands shaking noticeably. He shoved it into the machine himself. A loud, aggressive warning tone signaled yet another rejection. "Your machine is broken," Julian snapped, his voice cracking with rising panic. "You are completely incompetent. Go get your senior manager right now and tell him to fix this ridiculous system error before I have you fired." The head waiter did not flinch. He did not apologize. Instead, a calm, knowing smile touched his lips. This man was not a simple waiter. He was the senior director of operations I had personally appointed to restructure the club. He smoothly bypassed Julian's trembling frame and walked purposefully toward the center of the table. He stopped directly behind my chair and bowed deeply. "Welcome back, boss," the director said, his voice carrying perfectly across the dead, silent room. "Would you like to transfer this guest's bill to the corporate bad debt account? Or should I call the police right now?" Julian froze, his mouth hanging open as if all the oxygen had been violently sucked from his lungs. The 25 relatives around the table collectively gasped, their eyes darting wildly between the bowing director and me. Before the profound shock could fully register on their faces, I stood up. I reached into my leather briefcase resting on the floor and slammed a heavy, thick dossier right into the center of the dining table, rattling the crystal water glasses in the process. "There is no system error, Julian," I said, my voice sharp, fast, and completely devoid of warmth. "And there is no aura. There is no tech company, no revolutionary platform, and absolutely no institutional backing." I opened the folder, tossing the first document across the polished wood toward Chloe. He forged my electronic signature on a fake escrow contract using a dissolved corporate seal. I flipped to the next page, sliding it down the table. "Chloe, your $150,000 is entirely gone. It never went into an investment fund. Julian blew it on illegal offshore sports betting rings and overdue rent for a penthouse he cannot even afford." Chloe stared at the glaring bank statements, her hands trembling violently. A choked, devastated sob escaped her throat. Julian's face twisted in desperate, feral panic. He slammed his hands on the table. "That is a lie. Chloe, baby, listen to me. It is just a temporary cash flow problem. I can fix it. I will take out a mortgage on the house. I will get a home equity loan and pay you back every single cent by next week." I did not blink. I reached into the back of the folder and pulled out a single, heavily stamped legal document. I threw it directly at my father's chest. "He cannot take out a mortgage to save you, Julian, because you already did it 2 months ago." The blood drained completely from my parents' faces as they stared at the paper. "He forged your power of attorney, Dad," I stated, my words striking like a hammer. "He secretly extracted $100,000 of equity from your home and dumped it into a fake cryptocurrency wallet. The bank's foreclosure notice will be nailed to your front door tomorrow morning." The suffocating silence that followed was violently broken by the sound of flesh striking flesh. Chloe lunged forward, her hand connecting with Julian's jaw in a resounding, vicious slap. She ripped the diamond engagement ring off her finger and threw it directly into his face. Julian stumbled backward, his knees giving out. He collapsed onto the floor, surrounded by the shattered pieces of his fabricated life. He looked up at me, tears streaming down his face, his grand arrogance entirely vaporized. "Simone, please," he begged, crawling a few inches forward on the expensive carpet. "You are the boss here. You own this place. Please, just use your power to clear the bill. Pay for the party. Do not let them take me to jail. Just save my face this one last time." I looked down at the pathetic, broken man on the floor. "I only protect valuable assets, Julian," I replied coldly. "You are nothing but a total loss." I looked up at the director of operations. "Have security physically expel him from my property." 2 heavy-set security guards immediately stepped forward, Grabbing Julian by the arms of his expensive velvet jacket, he did not fight back. He went entirely limp, sobbing quietly as they dragged him backward out of the grand dining room and into the harsh reality of the cold street. The 25 aunts, uncles, and cousins who had just been loudly cheering for my downfall were now completely silent. They kept their heads bowed, staring intensely at the expensive porcelain plates, absolutely terrified to even make eye contact with me. My parents sat frozen in their chairs. My mother was weeping uncontrollably into her hands, while my father stared blankly at the forged mortgage document resting on the polished wood in front of him. For decades, they had relentlessly enabled his toxic behavior, blindly shielding their golden boy from every consequence. Tonight, the illusion was permanently shattered, and they were finally forced to look directly at the monster they had created. I stepped away from the wreckage of the table and gently pulled a devastated Chloe into a quiet corner of the room. She was shaking, mourning the total loss of her future and her grandmother's legacy. I reached into my pocket and handed her a small folded receipt. "Breathe, Chloe," I told her softly, "because I flagged his accounts early." My legal team's freeze order intercepted his final transaction. He tried to wire $110,000 to an offshore account right before the party started, but the system locked the funds in transit. You are getting the vast majority of your grandmother's money back by Monday morning. Chloe looked up at me, her eyes widening in pure disbelief before she collapsed against my shoulder, crying tears of profound relief. Before I left the room, I approached the director of operations. I handed him my personal card to generously compensate the waitstaff for their time and absolute discretion. However, I explicitly instructed him to submit the massive bill for the vintage champagne directly to the Financial Crimes Division of the police department. It was no longer a dinner tab. It was officially concrete evidence of wire fraud. I walked out of the heavy brass doors of the club and stepped into the crisp, cool Chicago night. People often misunderstand the nature of true revenge. They think it requires malice or drawing blood. It does not. Sometimes, the most devastating revenge is simply stepping aside, dropping the shield you have been holding up for them, and letting the brutal storm they created wash them away. I lost my entire toxic family tonight, but as I walked down the illuminated city street, taking a deep breath of the freezing air, I realized something beautiful. For the very first time in my 32 years of life, I was finally free. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my story today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please share your city or country in the comments below. If you found today's story engaging and want to help our channel survive during these tough times, please consider supporting us with just $1. Your incredible kindness allows our dedicated team to pay their bills, feed their families, and keep producing the high-quality stories you love. You can easily donate by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the secure donation link provided in the description and the pinned comment. We deeply appreciate every single one of you.